and yet she loved me and not him. Kneeling by him, I raised the noble head and chafed the poor broken hands that held within them the potency of such divine harmony as the world will never hear again, but the great soul had passed. Death was doubtless instantaneous, for though his face was unmarred, his body was horribly crushed and broken. Dispatching one of the bystanders to convey intelligence of the accident to the city, I went back and raised the weeping girl who was to have been the dead man's wife. "My darling," I said, lifting her gently, "you would have been true to him, and he was a godlike man and worthy of your troth, but surely the hand of Providence is in this terrible thing. Will you go and look upon him?" Taking my arm without speaking, I led her to where our Savior lay upon the ground, and with a solemn grace and dignity that was really majestic, she walked around to the dead man's feet and looked long and calmly at his face. "Thou wert too pure and great to be loved as a man," she spoke at last, "and in the presence of thy dead clay I feel as unworthy as Guinevere at the feet of the pure and royal Arthur. Alas! The world has lost its greatest spirit, and I a friend of whom I could never be worthy." Then as I led her away, "O my Lancelot, thou art not and never can be so good or great a man, and yet I love you." Concluded in November. Concluded for months, my beautiful wife had been fading like a flower. Even on shipboard and amid the excitement of the wildest storm, she seemed listless and totally indifferent to her surroundings. The boding sadness that began to come upon her after the terrible accident that resulted in the death of Professor Hallam, never left her, and while she sometimes simulated vivacity, her gaiety pained rather than pleased me, for my love penetrated her sweet little deception, and I knew that it was for my sake that she pretended what she did not feel. I had fondly hoped, and so had her parents, that when she was out of the country and away from the scenes that reminded her of her past, her old buoyancy of spirits would return. Indeed, but for this and the dreadful melancholia that grew upon her day after day, we would never have yielded to her desire to undertake the desperate journey to America. But it was not so, and the bitterness of my disappointment amounted to anguish. Every morning on board of the vessel, as on shore, she would awake at the exact moment when the wonderful matins of Professor Hallam had been wont to roll out from the Tower of Music, and listen wide-eyed and with every faculty strained to the utmost tension of alertness, listening. And as I lay beside her sometimes and held her hand, feigning sleep, I could feel the nervous tremor that agitated her, while her pulse fluttered with the intensity of the nervous strain. My God! It was terrible that my sweet wife, the most beautiful and gracious woman I ever knew and the only one I ever loved, should suffer like that. And at sunset she would listen for the nocturne with the same fever of excitement. Thus as long as we were in latitudes where day and night alternated, and when we reached the regions of the pole where there were no sun risings nor settings, instead of becoming better she grew worse, and this intense, preoccupied, listening attitude became habitual. I employed every artifice I could devise to interest her and fix her attention on objects about us, and she with the sweetest grace tried to be interested, but even as I held her hand and talked to her with all the animation I could affect, looking into the fathomless depths of her glorious eyes, I would lose her. With the most intense concentration of mind she would follow me and sense what I was saying for a few minutes, and then she listened indeed, but not to me. And oh, she tried so hard. One evening we stood by the rail on the quarterdeck looking out over the hissing brine at the sun, which hung red upon the horizon. It seemed as if it were just ready to sink out of sight, though really it had been but slightly above the horizon for many days. As I stood with one arm around her and holding her hand, her gaze was fixed on the red ball of fire that touched the ocean's rim and which was reflected in her eyes like the flashes in an opal. I drew her to me and spoke ardently of what I hoped to accomplish when we reached my own country, even putting my face against hers as I spoke. But I do not think she heard me. Like one hypnotized, she seemed totally oblivious of her surroundings, and I saw with a pang of anguish that she was listening for the strains of that glorious nocturne, such as was never heard except from the Tower of Music, and such as was never played by any hand save that of the dead master. And then I believed my heart broke. Then a pain struck through my breast that has never ceased from that hour to this, waking or sleeping. Dropping her hand, I fell forward with a groan, and catching the rail rested my head upon it. Starting as if she had been struck, my darling came back to herself, and with a cry fell down at my feet, and with a torrent of broken words and sobs begged me to forgive her. "Oh, my love," she cried, as the tears ran down her beautiful upturned face, "my heart is breaking for you, but I cannot help it, indeed I cannot. Oh! When I cannot see you or hear you, my heart aches for you with never-ceasing misery. I have struggled and I have prayed, but God will not help me. And I have feared that you might not understand, that you might think, oh, what shall I say? That you might not think that I love you and you only with all my heart. Oh, my husband, pity me and forgive your poor miserable, unfortunate wife. Oh, and she fell forward with her face against my knees, sobbing and quivering with the violence of her emotion. Lifting her gently in my arms while my heart was bursting, I carried her down into the cabin and laid her on her bed, and with her arms still about my neck as when they held me back from a fearful death that summer afternoon. I fell on my knees by the bedside, and with my face against hers, wept with her. And in the dim twilight of the cabin, while the sun hung red upon the rim of the sea, and the billows rustled along the vessel's side with a sad murmur like the sighing of an autumn wind, she told me that Professor Hallam's music had always impressed her in a way she could not understand. That whenever she heard his wonderful matins and nocturnes she seemed to lose herself, and was borne away on the billows of harmonious sound. She told me that she could even divine the music in advance of the playing, and knew each bar before she heard it as well as if she had composed it herself. Stranger than all, she said she always knew by some mysterious influence the very moment the music was going to begin, and she knew by that influence, that mysterious something, that the master was playing now, was playing all the time, and while she could not hear the music, by this strange power which dominated her, she felt it and knew what unutterable strains were being rendered in heaven or somewhere. She told me as she lay there with her soft arms about my neck and her dear face touching mine, that if she had the skill to set it down fast enough she could write the grand music that was being rendered day and night and day after day without cessation. At first, she said she only felt it evenings and mornings, and then more and more, until finally when we passed into the zone where there was no alternation of day and night, she felt that he was playing all the time. She could not hear it, but she felt its beauty and could not escape its power. She had kept this from me till now, seeing my suffering, she could no longer conceal it, but told me all, that I might not doubt her love, but pity and forgive her the pain she caused me. If she had done this at first, the great physicians of Ironia might have cured her of the malady, for such it must have been, and I entreated her to let me take her back then, but she would not consent. "Why, it has stopped now," she cried, holding my face between her hands and looking up at me with the love light in her eyes. "It stopped short off when you fell against the rail, and I know he would never play again even to the angels if he knew it caused me sorrow." And as I gazed into her face and saw the old look in her eyes, I thanked God and prayed that the spell might be broken, and that she might never again fall under the power of the dead man's music. I knew not that the end was so near, and when it came, it was as if God had struck me with a thunderbolt out of a clear sky. For a week, she had not come on deck and had scarcely been on her feet during the time. The hallucination that possessed her had not recurred since the day she told me all, and I was sure that in some inexplicable way her violent emotion at that time had been the means of breaking the spell. But the improvement I had looked for from that did not come, and she grew weaker, physically, day by day, or rather from hour to hour, as there was no alternation of day and night. We had sighted Barrington Strait and was laying off and on, keeping the towering ice wall in sight and waiting for a wind that would drive us through the current that runs like a mill race through the channel. For hours my beautiful wife, now so frail and white as to seem almost ethereal, had reclined on the lounge in the cabin with her eyes half closed and such an expression of heavenly peace upon her face that I felt awed as though in the presence of an angel. I was sitting at table trying to fix my mind upon a chart that I was making of the ice coast and the entrance to the strait, when with a slight cry she clasped her hands and opened wide her eyes with that look of listening expectancy I knew so well. Springing to her side with a half-uttered imprecation, I kneeled beside her and caught her clasped hands in mine. "Listen," she whispered excitedly, "he is going to play. I feel it now he is playing. It is the glorious nocturne he played that evening when we were by the river. Hark! I can hear it, oh, so grand." Her eyes closed and she moved her head forward and front side to side for some moments keeping time. "Edward, my husband, where are you?" "I am here, darling," I cried passionately, pressing her hands and imprinting a kiss on her partly opened lips. Then I am content, and withdrawing one of her hands from mine, she put an arm around my neck. I started to speak caressingly to her when she stopped me with a quick hush. "I am to sing. He is playing the prelude. Now he is motioning me to begin, now," and inhaling a deep breath she began to sing the great peace hymn of the Republic. Of old when down the star-girt sky, the angel voices swelled and ran. This was the burden of their cry. Peace, peace on earth, goodwill to man. In the refrain. Peace, 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 on all the earth peace. Peace, 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 among all men peace. Her voice swelled grandly and floated out over the black ocean. She drew my face down upon her bosom, and as the triumphant notes of this magnificent hymn, the masterpiece of Professor Hallam, rose and fell, my heart seemed to melt within me, my tears gushed forth, and I felt as if my spirit was outborne on the wings of song, far above the sphere of earthly hope and passion, beyond the sound of discord, beyond the veil of darkness, into a great luminous ethereal space that throbbed with the rhythmic measures of the music of the spheres. And as I floated upward on the waves of unutterable melody where there was no horizon and no sky, an angel held me by the hand and about the neck, and that angel, I felt, had been my wife. I was aroused by a touch on the shoulder, and looking up I saw the kind face of Captain Brant bending over me. "Where am I?" I asked in a dazed way. "You are in the hands of Almighty God," replied the captain solemnly, "who doeth all things well." I staggered to my feet and gazed about me, and then looking down saw the earthly image of my wife still and white as a reclining statue of marble. Her eyes were closed as though in slumber, and her lips were parted with a smile, and I realized that God had struck me the final blow. With a calmness I could not understand, I motioned him out of the cabin and bowed myself in the presence of my dead. When I went on deck again, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, and fingers of golden fire pointed from the rim of the black ocean to the zenith that was flushed with rosy light. But why should I linger with these sorrowful details? I was not stirred by any emotion and felt nothing except that dull pain in my heart, which has never left me. Captain Brant was like a father, and the boys pressed my hand with a silent sympathy that expressed far more than words. I say I was not moved by any great emotion, except once, when, after Captain Brant had read the solemn service for those who are buried in the sea and motioned to the mate to take me into his cabin while they committed my idol to the deep, then for a time I was crazed. I had nearly gone mad, and I believe I would have killed every man aboard the ship before I would have suffered them to cast that loved form into the cold hissing waters of that black sea. The weather was favorable, and as the billows rolled over and far up on the shelving ledge of the great berg, we had only to ride in on the crest of a wave and drawing the boat up make it fast on the ice. It was a little mountain of ice and snow,